be here. It's been an amazing experience so far. I'm Spa Victoria and Tasmanian President, and I'm also an evolutionary sociologist, and I specialise in population, environment and energy resources. And I'm also editor at candybetter.net, which is a website for reform in population, democracy, planning and environment and energy resources. I think that's all. I just want to say it's amazing how we kind of have similar things to you guys. We've got Web of Debt there prominently and publish Ellen Brown's articles. We've got a lot on flu actually from Brisbane protests and population, of course. So I've probably used up half my time. I'd just like to move this so I can talk into the microphone. So Jill Quirk has just given you a good idea of the rate of population growth in Australia and the political, social and environmental problems this is causing. Does Australia's or any population have to keep growing? It is not a natural inbuilt requirement that populations constantly increase in size, but many people believe it is. This ideology is present at popular, educated and specialist level in economics, religion and scientific theory. Towards the end of this talk, I'll try to get in some theory. However, I'm beginning here by describing the growth lobby, which seems to be the chief beneficiary of population growth in Australia and the chief culprit for promoting it. If you want to read more about my work in this area, here are two of my most recent books. They're both called Demography, Territory, Law, and first is The Rules of Animal and Human Populations. It's a multi-species population theory. And the second one is Land Tenure and the Origins of Capitalism in Britain. And then I'm doing another one on the origins of democracy in France, and then another one after Napoleon, which nobody will probably ever see those or read them, but I like to mention them. They're all about population and energy resources and political structures based on natural algorithms, genetic algorithms, which probably you can't imagine, but I've got some material on them and on candybetter.net if you want to see it later. Okay, what is the growth lobby? Has everybody heard of the growth lobby, or is that a totally alien concept? Could you have one person nodding? Anyone else? 2, 3, 4? Excellent, okay. It's formed of industries upstream and downstream from the property development lobby, which you probably noticed if you haven't heard it termed that way, who've come to depend on continuous population growth generated demand for their products and jobs. They are in corporations and government departments. This is rough, but upstream, they're providing raw materials, power, providing finished materials, bricks, mortar, financing development, banks financing mortgages, banks building societies, etc., investing in development, banks, political parties and all big business, buying land for developments, developing land, engineering, construction, building infrastructure, roads and houses. Well, that's kind of the stream as opposed to upstream. Downstream, they're deriving billions in stamp duty, the state governments, investing in land banks and development again, government and political parties. Why did I repeat that? Anyway, conveyancing lawyers, immigration agents, realtors, universities, which invest enormously in immigration and housing, media, marketing, housing. Murdoch and Fairfax own those property.coms, realestate.com.au and domain.com.au, and they're marketing our real estate and all kinds of assets internationally to the highest bidder, which explains why a lot of you seem to be here because you're concerned about your mortgage debts and so on. Okay. There is a theory about how unpopular and costly policies survive in a democracy where the benefits are focused among a few people who can organise to protect them, whereas the costs are diffused among many, thus difficult to recognise and organise against. The following cartoon illustrates this as an organised and wealthy rent-collecting growth lobby, Inc. swoops with a helicopter while people look around confused about what's happening. So you've got a bunch of people with standing room only on the beach and a lot of sharks around, and they're looking around wondering where this is all coming from. How did they get into this situation? And they're generally not aware that anyone is making money out of it, or how could they be, and why like the helicopter is supposed to demonstrate that the people making money from this confusion, from this attack from multiple angles, are actually organised to continue this, to keep it going. And that's your growth lobby. And they're saying, tenants of Australia, please pay your standing room only rent on time this month or vacate the premises. And one lady's saying, where is this all coming from? And they're all looking around. And I think that describes a lot of Australians at the moment. This is Bernard Salt of KPMG, who is a well-known media commentator and author, and he packages and markets statistical information to the growth lobby and actively promotes its interests. He admits 80% of us don't want population growth. In the video, which I won't play because we don't really have time, it's a bit boring because there aren't many graphics in it, he advises the property industry and the broader business community to employ people to covertly counter the anti-growth message from the 80% in the blogosphere and to balance their overwhelmingly negative comments on pro-growth articles in the mainstream media. And you've got the reference there. It's kind of comical. It's kind of comical because he's talking to a whole bunch of CEOs from councils and heads of huge development things and just a bunch of millionaires and billionaire considerations. And he's saying, you know, we're besieged by these people who are protesting all the time, and yet, I mean, part of the growth lobby is the mainstream media. Even the ABC is normalising this continuous population growth, saying resistance is impossible. So here are some peak bodies in the growth lobby. They're umbrella groups representing big business. Foremost, I'd say at the moment, is Property Council of Australia, but they keep changing their names. Business Council of Australia, Insurance Australia Group, the Minerals Council of Australia, and the Australian Banks Association. The Property Council of Australia's #1 mission is greater political influence. That's their 2009 statement, but it's the same. You got this amazing #1, greater political influence. It was an 8 or 10 point mission statement, and it was just sort of worse each thing. But they were boasting about how much political influence they have and how much influence in the media. Then you've got this thing, 6.2 billion they hope to gain by real estate investment trusts and not paying much tax in those. Just to give you an idea, the Victorian branch of the Property Council of Australia, some of their core members, a lot of them are government departments. It's kind of weird, isn't it? A commercial organisation that works against you and me. We're paying their membership via Human Resources and Housing Choices Australia. Well, actually, that's a private one. The Victorian Government's Places Victoria. The Salvation Army Victoria's Property Trust. Please donate. Baptist Village Baxter, Bennetus, that's another religious one, I think. Calvary Lutheran Church, Catholic Homes. Then you've got all the councils. Did they ask us? Anyway, you should be able to work out. It's a bit odd. University of Melbourne, of course, Monash University. All the universities would be members of the Property Council of Australia. Australia Post with its yellow envelopes asking us for more information and to trust them. RACV Limited, Medibank, Australand Holdings. That's just interesting because it's a big one and I think it's 55% Singapore owned, I'm not sure. But that's the one that Mr. Brax gave 20 hectares of Royal Park away to and gave them 80 million to build a little bit of cheap housing for the indigent. But most of it went to overseas buyers. That's the whole of Royal Park, actually. The hospital was turned into a suburb, which was largely sold off the plan, I believe, to overseas buyers. And so on, the banks, of course. But these people have 2,200 corporate members in Australia. They're based nationally and at state level, and they're also in councils and so on. It's amazing. It's like a huge iceberg. How can I? This is a cartoon I did some time ago, and it's not meant to pit employers against employees, and I'm probably more of a union person, but I've got two boats there. There are the unemployed and homeless and indebted in Australia because of the terrible cost of land and housing. and everything else. Power, which the corporations got hold of, they used to be publicly owned. And then you've got indebted small business, which is kind of like the unemployed and homeless and the underemployed, because it's got to make money, and it's also got to pay for business premises, and it's also got to pay our wages or your wages. And it's also supposed to make a profit. And it's also supposed to compete with overseas countries' products where they don't pay anything like this in land costs. Now, who's pushing up the land and rent costs? Well, I gather this... Oh, damn, sorry. So there's this little jigger I can press here. It's the High Immigration Growth Lobby, which is the Property Council of Australia, Minerals Council of Australia et al. And they're pushing up the land and rent costs to business, but to everyone. And that pushes up wages, if you like. We see the tip of the iceberg in the mainstream media, which is always going on about this conflict. We can't afford to pay these wages. But if you don't pay the wages to these people, they can't afford the land and rent costs. But if these guys pay the land and rent costs, they can't produce anything, which explains why a lot of small businesses are going out of business. And they've got nothing to do with the growth lobby. It's the big business, because growth lobby invests in the land costs. So they're deriving a rent. I suppose I've gone on a bit long there. But a point to be made is, why don't they just cut the land costs? And the reason is because the growth lobby doesn't let us discuss it. It's just not out there. They're keeping a lid on it. So, potential solutions. Some traditional avenues of resistance exist, although all are compromised in this system. One new one is present: the internet. The traditional options are power in public institutions and utilities, power of employment connections, power of family communication, power of local government. Power in public institutions and utilities. Historically, even though our system placed much power in private hands, in the 19th and 20th centuries, we built up public institutions that safeguarded citizens' rights to affordable water and food, electricity, housing, education, reliable employment, regulated banking. Most of these public institutions that protected our rights have since been privatised and taken beyond our influence. Power of employment connections. Unions once brought together workers with common cause to preserve financial and other easily identifiable benefits, but the support of industrial relations and law institutions have largely been dismantled, and Australian workforces are now dispersed and temporary. Furthermore, unions are now entwined with the growth lobby interests due to their involvement in superannuation as corporations. It would be good if the unions could develop new socially representative functions. I take note today that I'm speaking in the historical Victorian Trades Hall Council, where I've often been. Power of family communication. As Jill described, one of the problems of population growth and infrastructure expansion is that it means that planners constantly insert new people and groups and buildings and roads and activities amongst us, interfering with established human networks of family, clan, church and suburb. Passive entertainment and homelessness increases this disturbance. Ironically, wealthy families and clans that stick together, like the Dennis Family Corporation, the Murdochs, the Packers and the Windsors, rule the world. But we're all being split up and divided and chasing jobs, commuting 2 hours, hardly talk to each other, watch the television. We lack engagement, we lack existential engagement, we don't feel real, a lot of us, because we're not in the newspaper, we don't have a title, we're not designated as important, so who are we to have opinions or influence? But we should. Relocalisation trends. As more Australians become unemployed and cannot afford housing, the upside is that they will default back to family, clan and locality and communicate with neighbours on issues of mutual convenience and, where possible, grow food and trade at the same level. Direct power at local level, accessed by well-networked families and clans, together with neighbours, is probably the most effective way to counteract the growth lobby. There are a lot of wires down here. The growth lobby on the ground and decisions by unrepresentative, distant central governments. Women truly seem to lead most of the coordinated local and state actions against overdevelopment and overpopulation in Melbourne, heading democratic planning groups, public land defence groups, ecological and wildlife protection groups, contributing to alternative media, attending Parliament and organising demonstrations, which are rarely reported in the newspapers, but they're going on all the time outside the House of Parliament in Melbourne. Our political engagement is, of course, underreported in the mainstream media, as you would expect. Please recognise our work, our names and support us. And I guess I should say, take these messages home to your families and try to get them active. Encourage your mothers and your grandmothers to get out there, because I guess what women have, apart from, as Jill said, a reliance on the Commonwealth, because we don't earn quite so much, and you've got children, you've got to, you know, schools, hospitals, all that stuff. You're kind of putatively at home. You might also be working, there is a reliance on the community for women with children particularly, but also older women who are easily phased out of the workforce. We have two things. We have independence and we have invisibility. And we're quite useful as political agents, speaking as one, you know. It's good. You don't get noticed, and nobody really believes that you could be seriously a problem until they read you on the internet. And we need to give our women some heroism here. Women led the march on Versailles, by the way, when they went to get the flower, and they... it was a long march. It was the first march on the King, and they brought him back in a carriage, and that was the beginning of Louis the XVI, I think, 16th imprisonment, which finished up in his beheading. So people don't often talk about that, but the women of Paris got totally jacked of not being able to feed their children, and so they just marched. It was amazing. I mean, why don't we have a Women's Day every year celebrating this brilliant march? Why don't we imitate it and march on Parliament? But anyway, power of local government to control population numbers. Most people believe that immigration is entirely managed by the federal government, but it is at the level of local government that population control actually starts. Local government traditionally controls building permits to control population numbers by limiting subdivisions and land clearing. This mechanism gave Australians direct control over the size of their communities. State governments in Australia have been removing this very important local government power over decades, with local government amalgamations, administrative control and laws reducing local power. Local power is the most direct and potentially useful form of democracy, more likely to unite people with a stake in the same bit of the real world. State government. I guess I'm telling you stuff that you might not be aware of about how it works around you. You know, anyway. In Australia, the states have the power over land use and water and power resources, and the ability and responsibility to signal when infrastructure is close to capacity. They have largely taken over immigration policy decisions from the federal government by calling themselves regions in need of migration. That's from Jeff Kennett's time. And setting up websites and industries to market housing, business investment and citizenship to prospective economic immigrants all over the world. All the states do this, but in Victoria the website is www.liveinvictoria.vic.gov.au, and obviously this website needs to come down, or we need to have more influence over it. The national government makes decisions to support wars and sets policies for humanitarian and economic immigration. The public messaging system has erroneously convinced many people that most immigrants are refugees, using the issue as a wedge tactic to prevent people speaking out on numbers. At the same time, the media fails to critically examine the fact that many of our refugees and asylum seekers come from the places where we are engaged with NATO in what are arguably illegal resource wars. The Australian public is given no say in whether we support such wars. The alternative media can highlight truth and reduce confusion on this. The pro-growth forces control the mass media. That is the public messaging system, which seems largely to control our election choices, like who gets up there, and politicians' policies. The effect is that although the majority of Australians do not want population growth or its impacts, their opinion is not clearly reported and they are not aware of each other. Most of the Australian media and much overseas media are owned by Packer, Fairfax and particularly the Murdoch corporations, which have vested interests in massive population growth, most obviously in their property.coms, which sell Australia. I've already said that. I'm just mentioning that CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, the ABC and SBS, generally all mainstream Anglophone press share biases and syndicate reports. ways to use the alternative media, the internet. So, how do we overcome a commercially compromised and unresponsive public messaging system that repetitively pervades this propaganda, making us believe it is both irresistible and true? By going around it and creating media that is far more relevant to most people, on the principle that real news is of real interest and that people, although schooled to passively absorb anointed opinion if they wake up, don't want to go to sleep again. Use the growth lobby's weasel words back at them, talk of reforming their attitudes to environment and public goods, cite their appalling tax avoidance boasts, point out how much money they are making, list government memberships of the Property Council of Australia next to the relevant politicians' names and faces. The traditional media relies a lot on distant authorities and events which we cannot verify or affect. The alternative media can convey news from people on the ground, almost anywhere in the world. Don't underestimate YouTube. For all the amateurs out there, it's probably more reliable than the Australian mass media. The traditional media creates stars and elevates as authorities, people who continually tell us that we must have growth. It is hard to get the attention of family, neighbours, colleagues and friends to our divergent point of view because they are conditioned to give more respect to mass media stars and opinions than to direct communication and experience. And this is part of the alienation that results in our loss of engagement with our politics. It's like we can't even scratch the surface. We don't exist. Alternative star system. The alternative media can identify our own real heroes and authorities, like the many women in Melbourne, who head up groups to fight overpopulation, etc. And we can be like many grassroots organisations and the BRICS countries, which now use the alternative media a whole lot. Syndication. The traditional media syndicates news and feature articles. We should do the same by republishing each other's work on our various websites, by reciprocal interviewing and by inviting each other to speak at events, thus raising our mutual profiles and amplifying our impact collectively. And Jill and I really appreciate being invited to speak here, and we had no idea what we were going to find here. We just couldn't work out what this thing was about, so it's good. Alternative performance. Here I am performing. Whilst it is often helpful to get a mainstream celebrity to speak at an event, try to put some of your own on the stage as well, or preferably just put your own on the stage, so that they will become known in their own right. Present them as experts. This is what the Property Council of Australia and APOC do. I note that Freedom Summits is doing this. Oh, shit, sorry. What have I done? Hang on. Interesting.
That was the appropriate response anyway.
Seems to go down. Okay, I've done that, all right. Just as we can create our own stars in the blogosphere, we can publicise the names and faces of our political representatives in association with their deeds and misdeeds, something which mainstream political parties avoid by having cosy relationships with the mainstream media, albeit at a cost. This is something I actually learned from Ted Baillieu when he was in opposition, and we were talking at a swimming pool closing down protests, and I said, well, what do you reckon we can do? And he said, attach a face to the deed, they hate that. So his face is all over Can Be Better, of course. Hansard is invaluable for records of bills, laws and remarks. It is filled with excellent speeches which can be used as completely free sources of articles. They can be published whole or cited. You can find dialogues there that are hilarious and tragic and immensely quotable quotes. It is far more fascinating than The Age or The Australian or a comic strip. It's just amazing. We should just publish it as the national broadsheet. We can exert, I'm quite serious, there's some really good speeches. So we can exert our power on our political representatives by paying attention and republishing what they say in Parliament, rewarding them by publishing good work that rarely gets reported by the mainstream who are into bad work. In this way, we can make good politicians more important and help their careers, but reduce the manufactured popularity of those who serve the growth lobby and don't represent us. Organising, this is probably a bit repetitive, it's corporatised. I did want to say NGOs are a problem because NGOs have to kind of register and they have membership that they guard tightly, and they tend to have wedge politics between other NGOs, and they're so eminently infiltratable that I prefer to work also with a loose association, loose networks. And I must say that candybetter.net, which James Cinnamon here actually started and built himself in Drupal for privacy and anonymity and so on, is great because we have all kinds of authors, and any of you are welcome to write, and they can opt in and opt out. Nobody sticks around if it's not doing what they like. Whereas in an NGO, it kind of becomes your little village, especially in a villageless world. Challenging local laws that stop us having livestock and water for growing food. I'm just talking about relocalisation, the need to organise locally. You've probably already heard that sort of stuff. I think it's excellent getting together with Aboriginal land tenure. To be quite frank, I disagree entirely with commercial land sales. I think everything should be just leased. Like with the Maori land tenure, like no Maori is homeless. That's how we should all depart. Every member of the tribe has a home, and you don't make new members of the tribe if you don't have a home for them. Laws should be primarily for the benefit of local communities. Oh yeah, this is important. Then integrated into region and continent. Inheritance and land tenure systems need reform along Roman law lines, like Western continental Europe. Roman-style laws preserve land within families, share land equally between men and women in inheritance, and minimise land fragmentation and speculation. Basically, this means that our inheritance system and land use allocation and planning system need reform towards male and female equal inheritance, prohibition against disinheritance of children, legitimate or illegitimate, and leasing to substitute for land sales. And I guess I don't really have time to explain this. The rest of my talk, which I put at the end, was originally at the beginning, but I just didn't know if anybody would be into evolutionary theories as to why we have to or we don't have to keep growing. And I don't know if there's any time. Is there? Does anyone want me to go into this? What's the... So, okay.
We've really only got a couple of minutes, but if you can do it quickly, that's great.
Well, I'll just go until the 2 minutes are over. Okay. There's war, famine, pestilence and death. Inclusive fitness gene maximisation theory is often interpreted to say that we are naturally doomed to overpopulation. This selfish gene theory that genes will always maximise their number by maximising the number of organisms they are present in has given scientific cachet to a belief that therefore human population will inexorably tend to increase and may only be staggered by chronic disease and disasters or cures for diseases which are then thought to have caused contemporary huge overpopulation. This theory depends on an ideal of chronological progress and depends on recently observed high birth rates and death rates in some undeveloped countries, including 18th and 19th century Britain, and it supposes that all people always had such high birth rates until they were industrialised. Working back from this, it assumes that the only reason the human population did not get bigger faster was because of the supplement of a high rate of ordinary death rates with massive disasters like supervolcanoes, etc., and massive plagues. The demographic transition theory is the default assumption for politicians and economists because it allows business as usual and isn't really a theory. It supposes that through some mysterious process inherent in industrialisation, populations will slow down, but only if every society is industrialised. This is a catch-22 because industrialisation cannot happen without excess landless labour. So first they have to dispossess you. Other people think contraception is a good idea. Against the biological maximal imperative assumption of humans and other species always reproducing to their biological maximum and having high death rates and low life expectancy are observed populations where this did not happen, and theories which develop rules showing that the huge numbers involved in overshooting resources by a species are probably rare and do not last for long. And Pimentel and Newman, my book, which has a reference, the rules of animal and human populations. Kaplan, Gerben and Winkling's evolutionary theory of human lifespan theorises that humans have potential to live for about 70 years in hunter-gatherer environments. They theorise that reaching age 65 must have played a part in human evolutionary adaptation for the acquisition of life learning and storage of environmental knowledge over long periods of time and distance in elderly humans. Furthermore, they think people reach full hunting expertise only around the age of 35. One might also observe logically that if people died at 20 or 30, especially if they had late menarches around 18 or even 20 years of age, that's when you get your period and you become fertile, then they would not have been able to raise their children to much survival level because they wouldn't have got past 10 before they died. Kaplan and others note that human and other species populations all have particular developed immunities in line with their local or regional environments. This is why invaders often took out other populations more by plague than by weaponry. Implications are that populations that remained in home territory long enough to adapt probably were not disease-ridden and probably had good potential to live out their lives. This is against what we're told, which is the Industrial Revolution permitted us all to live past 30 years of age. Some even say 20 years of age. I personally think this is total, complete and utter crap. But you can't really say that. You can't really write a thesis in university saying that. You can just write a little bit, but Kaplan and others are pretty good on that. Thus, when we look at so-called developing countries like Africa or India, we can deduce that they were not always overpopulated or disease-ridden, primarily because they had huge volumes of intact biomass with huge animals, predator and herbivore. You're not going to have those animals if the place is overcrowded. Centuries of slavery, then colonisation, disorganised and displaced the Africans. China's population started exploding with the Portuguese foothold in Macau in the 16th century, and the Portuguese were influenced by the English system. Then with Mao Zedong, Japan sounds like an Eden during the Edo period before it was open to trade. India's land tenure and inheritance laws were rewritten by the British to resemble their own, which produced excessive landless labour, and that's my specialty. Idyllic 14th century Haiti was overrun by forced migration of African slaves, and the tradition of cultivating landless labour continues there. Fabulously fertile Nauru was wrecked by phosphate mining from the 18th century. Now they have to import water from Australia, the driest continent on earth. Easter Island was probably pillaged by slavers and loggers rather than actually overpopulating itself. And similar processes are speeding up in Australia, which is handicapped by its British land tenure and inheritance traditions, in my view. And I suppose I have to stop somewhere, unfortunately. So I'll stop there.